How about a chicken pot pie? This dish is obviously made from a rich roux base, and you add chicken and a variety of vegetables, and then of course there's your dough. Well, let's say you wanted to do that chicken pot pie and not change anything. So maybe instead of having a traditional pie crust, just have the top crust instead of having the top and the bottom. Or you can use a lighter sauce using maybe some 2% milk instead of half and half or cream, or maybe using other ingredients to make the pie crust. So there's a lot of different things you can do. If you want to serve the traditional one and not alter it at all, serve a very small portion of it instead of a big portion. What about sauces and dressings? When we're talking about like a white sauce, this alternative sauce can be the foundation of a lighter cooking style. So you want to use a very good defatted stock and thicken with arrowroot. And that is a good substitution for a very rich traditional sauce. What about creamy dressings? Creamy dressings are traditionally made with mayonnaise or sour cream. Some use heavy cream. I've even seen a lot of recipes done with cream cheese. So all those are very heavy ingredients. So maybe try to substitute things like tofu or pureed white beans or using non-fat yogurt. But if you don't want just the non-fat yogurt, maybe mix that in with some regular mayonnaise. I've even used non-fat milk, and then you're going to add other seasonings to give you that depth of flavor. I have another recipe that I do. It's a creamy dressing. It's a mango dressing, and I use a little bit of mayonnaise, a little bit of olive oil, but I whip it with fresh garlic and fresh mango, and I blend that all together with an immersion blender, and it tastes very creamy, and it has very little bit of fat and no cream at all. So it's important to think about just simple changes that you can make in your everyday recipes. What about oil and vinegar dressings? Most of your classic dressings have a ratio of 1 to 3 parts, so 3 parts oil to 1 part vinegar, but maybe use less oil, or try a slightly thickened stock or some sort of reduction that you have. Maybe use a flavorful oil, like a hazelnut oil or pistachio oil. Then add some fresh herbs and spices, or maybe even chilies, or maybe diced vegetables, just to kind of change it up a little bit. Using shallots instead of onions, maybe add different types of mustard. I like to add stone ground mustard just to give a little texture and something a little bit different mouthfeel. So there's a lot of things that you can do that you may not have thought of, and you can take one recipe and vary it, several different ways that you can still use the same ingredients you have on hand, but just, make it a little bit different each time. What about desserts? Desserts are tricky, but even something rich like a carrot cake, typically has a batter consisting of shredded carrots and oil and eggs and brown sugar and spices and nuts. Well, you can always reduce the amount of oil in a recipe. You can substitute the cream cheese frosting with a non-fat yogurt sauce, or you can make the traditional cream cheese frosting and just put a little dollop on the top of each slice, as opposed to smearing the frosting on the whole cake and have it be, the majority of the calories in that dessert. So there's a lot of things that you can do. You can omit the nuts if you're trying to, reduce the calorie content, because desserts, quite frankly, really add to a lot to the calorie content of a meal. Garnishing, with fresh fruit is always very, very pretty and appealing, and you can see how creative they were in using the little sauce or frosting on the side. So there's a lot of things that you can do to make something a little more balanced. oatmeal raisin cookies, at least you have some ingredients there that are healthful, like your oatmeal, like raisins. But again, traditional cookie recipe uses a lot of sugar, butter, eggs, spices. But you can use a recipe that has mostly applesauce and just a little bit of canola oil. The cookie end result of the cookie is not exactly the same, but it still gives you a delicious dessert. And think about it, you're getting the alternative, which is oatmeal and golden raisins, which might be really fit into the category of nutrition by addition. So if you have to have your sweet, at least there's some underlying nutritional benefits. We'll be covering health concerns related to gluten in Chapter 11, but for the sake of gluten-free baking, let's review. It's really important for the culinary professional to meet the needs of their guests. Gluten is just one contemporary concern many people are all consumed with, whether they need to or not, unfortunately. Gluten is the protein part of all forms of wheat, and that includes durum, semolina, and spelt. It's also in rye, barley, and grain hybrids such as triticale and kamut. Gluten intolerance is an inherited autoimmune condition, also known as celiac disease. People with this condition cannot tolerate gluten when it comes in contact with the small intestine. In fact, gluten will eventually destroy their small intestine. Some people can tolerate small amounts of gluten without a reaction. Others have severe symptoms from any contact at all with gluten. Gluten intolerance is not a wheat allergy, but wheat is the key food to avoid in order to control the gluten intolerance. Symptoms of gluten intolerance are generally abdominal bloating, pain, diarrhea, weight loss, and fatigue. Wheat allergy, on the other hand, has respiratory symptoms and it could be severe symptoms. But more and more diners are requesting gluten-free food, and the demand for gluten-free retail products is growing. Websites such as www.allergyeats.com and others provide lists of restaurants that offer gluten-free menu options, or some are entirely gluten-free. So there's a lot more resources just because of the demand. But whether a person's doing it because it's a contemporary way to eat or because they truly have a gluten intolerance, food and culinary professionals have to be aware, have to have an understanding, and have to be prepared when you're providing your food options. The gluten-free diet eliminates all food, beverages, and medications that are made from ingredients that contain gluten, including items made with any type of wheat flour, which is all-purpose, white, or wheat. Baking with gluten-free flours and starches can be challenging because gluten contributes very important properties to various types of baked products like cookies, cakes, pastries, and breads. Many ingredients contain hidden gluten. Gluten wheat is used as a flavoring agent, as a fermenting agent, and also a stabilizer. As more ready-made foods become available for food service, it will be imperative to know all the components. Here's a list of foods that always or usually contain gluten. Some are obvious, some are not. Wheat, barley, rye, triticale, which is a cross between wheat and rye, oats, unless it's specifically labeled gluten-free. And the problem here is that oats themselves they do not contain gluten, but because they are processed generally in the same area where wheat is, it's hard to keep them gluten-free. So they're gluten-free only if they're labeled gluten-free. Malt, as in barley malt extract, brewer's yeast, dextrin, modified food starch. There's a whole lot of other foods, specific foods. Um, and again, things like alcohol, artificial vanilla. Pure vanilla is fine, but artificial vanilla can have gluten. Baked beans that are thickened with flour. Cooking sprays for baking, they may contain some wheat flour or starch. Think about breading, breads, muffins, biscuits, flour tortillas. Broth even contains gluten. Brown rice syrup, generally it's made from barley. Things like buckwheat and buckwheat pasta or soba noodles are made from wheat flour. Cake icings and frostings can sometimes be made with small amounts of wheat flour or starch. Obviously, cookies, pies, cobblers, cakes. Caramel color made from barley. Cereal products made from cereal. Cheese spreads and sauces that are thickened with wheat starch or protein. Chocolates and licorice containing wheat flour. Coating mixes. Communion wafers, crackers, croutons. Dextrin made from wheat. Flavored coffee mixes that contain chip-like ingredients made from cookie crumbs. Gravies and sauces. Hydrolyzed vegetable protein, HVP, or textured vegetable protein, TVP, or hydrolyzed plant protein, HPP. Things like imitation bacon, imitation seafood, marinades, any frozen meats or products that have breadcrumbs. Modified starch or modified food starch. Pastas, processed meats with fillers, rice cakes, crackers, roux and sauces made with roux, self-basting poultry, soup bases, soy sauce fermented with wheat, specialty mustard, stuffing, tempeh seasoned with soy, thickeners. Vegetable burgers or meat substitutes may have been made with wheat gluten, wheat proteins, or barley malt. So you can see there's a ton of different products. So that's why it's so important to have a good relationship with, your vendor so that you can really have a handle on what you're serving your clients. So again, it's not to be taken lightly, and it's very important to understand, where gluten lies. What about the cans? What can people with gluten eat? Food staples of a gluten-free diet include, obviously, any of your fresh fruits and vegetables, whether they're frozen or dried, your fresh meat, fish, and poultry, of course, without wheat breading, and eggs. Things like potatoes, corn, beans, rice, quinoa, buckwheat, millet, flax, sorghum, and teff. You have your dairy products, cereals made without wheat or barley malt, lentils and other legumes, seeds such as amaranth, flax, sesame, and sunflower. And then, of course, there's a bunch of specialty foods such as pasta, bread, crackers, pancakes that are made with the permitted grains like rice, tapioca, arrowroot, potato, soy, or corn flours and starches. So there's a lot of things that people with, gluten intolerance can have. I want to reiterate the grains and starches that are allowed in the gluten-free diet. Amaranth, arrowroot, bean and bean flours, buckwheat, corn, corn flour, popcorn, corn tortillas, cornmeal, grits, polenta, taco shells, unseasoned corn tortilla chips, couscous, millet, nut flours, potato flour, puffed rice, corn or millet, pure gluten-free oats and oat flour, quinoa and quinoa flour, plain rice, including brown rice, rice flour, rice noodles, and rice crackers, sorghum, sorghum flour, soy, soy flour, tapioca, tapioca flour, teff, teff flour, and wild rice. When diners indicate that they are gluten intolerant, you must be direct and honest if you do not have gluten-free items on the menu. Some things that you can always offer: salads that are made with fresh vegetables and fruits, served with homemade vinaigrettes. Of course, you want to use distilled vinegar, as the distilling process actually destroys and, filters out any of the gluten. Obviously, you want to skip the croutons. Broth-based soups without noodles are generally a really good alternative to the cream or roux-based soups. Meat or seafood can be broiled, roasted, sautéed, braised, stewed, or even pan-fried. The most important thing to remember is preparation. No wheat flour can be used during the dusting of the meats when you braise or stew. Sauce can't be made with a wheat flour roux. If meat or fish is sautéed, always remember to use a clean pan and clean tongs. Sauces that are reduced from liquids are ideal. If the sauce has to be thickened, use arrowroot, potato flour, cornstarch, or tapioca flour instead of wheat flour. Veggies can be steamed with butter. Tortilla chips or French fries can be prepared in a clean pot with fresh oil. Rice, remember, is gluten-free, even the glutinous sticky rice. Many unusual grains are exciting to experiment for the creative plate. Things that you may not think about, like amaranth or quinoa, teff, millet, or buckwheat. And then, of course, many desserts have a wheat component. Even the famous flourless chocolate cake should be offered with caution because it's generally baked in a floured pan. A cheese course with dried fruit and nuts is always a welcome treat. Avoid offering blue cheese from Europe because it may have gluten particles due to the fermentation and aging process. Breakfast items might include eggs prepared in a variety of ways, homemade hash browns, fresh juice, and 100% juice. So, as you can see, there's a lot of options, and it's not something that should be viewed as annoying if a client is requesting that. In fact, so many restaurants are offering it, it's become, very commonplace. But as a culinary professional, it's extremely important to be prepared. That's the most important thing. Refer to page 290 and 291 of your textbook for the various types of gluten-free flours and starches and all their characteristics. Like anything, it will be important to experiment to achieve success in developing products that are acceptable and palatable, and also that have any kind of shelf life. Gluten-free breads have a different look and feel from conventional breads made with wheat flour. So there's a lot of things to consider. There's also a lot more bakeries that have this type of product that you can actually purchase, but you have to consider the additional costs involved. So what happens when you bake without gluten? Baking without gluten flours and starches can be really challenging because it's the gluten that contributes those very good properties to things like cookies and cakes and pastries and breads. Gluten development is not as important for cookies as it is for cakes. But you can use some of the gums, the guar gums, the xanthan gum, to help retain gas and give gluten-free baked goods structure and volume and texture that they need, that gluten would normally give. So there's a lot of things that you can do, but obviously you want to experiment with those and be sure that you come up with a good end product. Because the emphasis on gluten has been around for a longer period of time, there's certainly a lot more resources available. Cakes and other types of batter-based products like pancakes need gluten for its gas-retaining ability to help produce a better product that's light and airy and has a tender crumb. But bread is probably the most challenging just because Gluten provides structure and it gives you that tender crumb and also helps retain gas. So experimenting and practicing, really helps you create a loaf that's worthy of presentation and also function and flavor. With experimentation and practice, trying different flours and gums can be used to create With experimentation and practice, trying different flours and gums can be used to create a loaf with good volume, softness, and texture, and for any product for that matter. Page 292 and 293 of your textbook has many other wonderful gluten-free baking tips, along with a few recipes. There are many gluten-free flour blends that you can use in making breads and other baked goods. And, the formula just might be combining some of those different flours. Some flours, obviously have a total different makeup, so you do have to experiment with those. Gluten-free flours have much less protein than wheat flour, and many are lower in fiber. And that's really the case for the consideration to think about when making the decision on your own to go gluten-free. When you're giving up, whole food groups, and in this case, wheat flour, an ingredient, you're getting rid of a lot of nutrients and a lot of fiber. So your gluten-free products are generally not the same as eating white, the whole grain bread. So choose mostly whole grain flours to improve the fiber and nutrient content of your baked goods. Whole grain flours, especially things like bean flours, are going to contain more protein and help give more structure to your baked goods. Another thing to really consider is trying to avoid cross-contamination or cross-contact. You want to make sure that all surfaces are cleaned thoroughly, and you want to keep those gluten-free ingredients totally separated from the gluten-containing foods. You want to keep all gluten-free ingredients and foods totally away from the gluten-containing foods. Wheat flour can also linger in the air in the kitchen for over 24 hours, so you might want to do your gluten-free baking first. Make sure you have scrubbed your kitchen and tools before starting, and always remember to use a different rolling pin and work surfaces. This information that we've talked about here is a mere toe dipping into the topic of gluten-free baking. For more information, there are a lot of excellent resources. Shelley Case is a dietitian that has written numerous books, and she has one called The Gluten-Free Diet, a comprehensive resource guide. There's also a lot of really good information on the Celiac Disease Foundation website, which is www.celiac.org. If you're specifically looking at baked goods, an author by the name of Jay Duane has a book called Bake Deliciously, Gluten and Dairy-Free Cookbook. Another important thing to remember is that everyone in the kitchen and the front of the house should be educated on gluten intolerance. Think about it. Eating out is such a profound social event that makes us feel good in spirit and also mind. People who are gluten intolerant have a very difficult time dining out because they feel afraid of eating something that will make them ill. So restaurants really must remain sustainable. Serving a group with special needs will develop trust and long-lasting relationships. So it can be a lot of extra work for your staff, but think about the outcome when you serve that group that knows, what you're about, what you offer, and that you care and have an understanding. That truly means a lot to people who are very concerned about this topic. So that ends our discussion on gluten-free baking. Please be prepared to participate in the discussion board on the topic of managing food waste.